Okay guys, we're going to review factoring today. On your factor review, I picked 4 questions from previous SOLs that I knew had to do with factoring based on a few words. So first word that we see is the word factor. Anytime we see factor or factoring or which of the binomials could be part of the factorization, any of that, we know we're asked to factor this quadratic. Other synonyms that ask us to factor but take it a step further are things like solutions, x-intercepts, roots, and zeros. So anytime we see those, I'll talk about an additional step that we'll do after we factor our quadratic. So here it asks us to factor. Remember, first thing that we want to do is a factor puzzle. We have to get it memorized that AC is at the top and B is at the bottom. So with AC, I do 1 times -6 and get -6. B is -1, and then I start guessing and checking. So to get a negative when I'm multiplying, I need a negative times a positive. And then when I'm taking a negative and a positive and I'm adding to get a negative sum, the negative number has to be bigger and the positive number has to be smaller. So my factor puzzle, I put the negative on the left and the positive on the right. And then I start guessing and checking numbers. So first factor I always check for is 6 and 1, so it's 1. 6 divided by 1 is 6. So when I do a -6 times 1, I get -6, but -6 plus 1 does not give me -1. So I move on to 2. I check to see if 2 is factor of 6 by doing 6 divided by 2. It is, because it gets me 3. So I checked for a -3, because remember the bigger number has to be negative and +2. Those multiply to get -6, and they do add to get -1. So -3 and 2 are my 2 terms that I'm going to use. I'm going to take x squared minus x minus 6, and I'm going to split that the minus x into -3x and then plus 2x. I want to make sure that this operation is always addition. For the other operations, it really doesn't matter, but the middle one always has to be addition. I bring down my other terms, and then I group my first 2, and then I group my last 2 with, again, that addition sign still staying in the center, not in a group. Then once I do that, I'm pulling out a GCF from each group. So in my first group, my GCF is x. They both have an x. They both don't have a coefficient other than 1, so I'm only pulling out x. To see what's left, I divide both terms by x. So x squared divided by x gets me x. -3x divided by x gets me -3. I bring down that addition sign, and then I check for a GCF in my second group. 2x and 6 share a 2. They don't share an x value, so I divide both of these by 2, and I get x minus 3 again. Now I'm checking for a GCF in the whole thing, so I see what they have in common is x minus 3. That's their common factor. I'm going to pull out that x minus 3, and then I'm going to write in parentheses what's left over. Now the question says, which of the following binomials is a factor of x squared minus x minus 6? Now, all of my answers aren't in parentheses, but that's because we're just talking about one of them individually. The only reason why we need parentheses here is to show that we're multiplying these 2 parts. But if I'm just talking about my factors, I would say something like my factors are x minus 3 and x plus 2. I don't need parentheses around those to say that they're factors. I need parentheses around those to show that they're multiplying, but not to talk about them as factors. So I take a look at my answer choices. I see that x minus 3 is an answer choice. So I know here that I'm going to choose that x minus 3. B is going to be one of the most common ones that we see chosen for the simple fact that some people will do this problem by using their calculator instead of factoring, and they're going to see that their x-intercept is a -2, so they assume that their factor is x minus 2. I want to go ahead and pull up our calculator, though, and show you what that looks like when we do this on our calculator. So we're going to get a graphing calculator if we have not already. And then we end up going to the y equals screen. So that's your top left button in your graphing options. And then we're going to type in our quadratic that was given to us in the original problem. So again, pull out a graphing calculator, go to your y equals screen,
type in x squared minus x minus 6, and then hit the graph button while we wait for mine to pull up. So x squared minus x minus 6, we're going to type this guy in to the y equals screen. All right, so we're going to go to y equals here. I already have something in there, so I just hit the clear button. And then we type in x squared minus x minus 6. It's going to be a great way to check our work. We see our quadratic graphed, and we see that we have 2 zeros here. So the first 0 is here, the second 0 is here. Remember, when I have zeros, they are opposite of our factors. So if I want to make sure that these zeros are correct based on what I have, I can go to second and then the trace button right here, and I can calculate a 0. Okay, remember, I want the left bound, so that means to the left of the 0. If I'm looking at this 0, it's on this side. If I'm looking at this 0, it's on this side. Really key hint is you should be using the left arrow to get to the left bound and the right arrow to get to the right bound. So we're going to go to the left bound. Doesn't matter where on the left side you go, just has to be somewhere on the left. And then the right bound using the right arrow, and then we get as close to the 0 as possible, and it calculates it as -2. Now the important thing is -2 is the 0, but the factor is the opposite of that. So it's going to be x plus 2 that represents that factor of 0. So we're going to now calculate the other 0. So again, we want left bound. First, I have to use the right key to get over there to my next 0. Okay. But once I do that, way too far. Once I do that, I have to use my left key to go to the left of that 0. So there's my 0, use the left key to go to the left bound, use the right key to go to the right bound, and then try to get as close to the 0 as possible, and then the 0 is 3. Again, 3 is the 0, but the factor that represents that 0 is x minus 3. Okay, we know this because if we're asked to find solutions or roots or x-intercepts or zeros, we would take each of these factors here and set them individually equal to 0. And then solve for x. So I would add 3 to both sides here and get x equals 3, subtract 2 from both sides here and get x equals -2. And those are the two numbers that we found on our calculator when we plugged in our quadratic and calculated the 0. So this is what you were asked to do, factor. But you can use your calculator to check if those factors are correct by finding the zeros of each factor and then checking in the graph to make sure those zeros are visually represented. Okay, so again, up until this point, the question is talking about factoring. If the question asks for things like solutions or zeros or roots or x-intercepts, you do this next step and you set each of the factors equal to 0. Make sure that you are practicing. Again, I have an extra help session tomorrow morning at 7:45. If you need more help beyond today, please make sure that you're working individually, but you are allowed to ask questions to your partners with permission from the adult in the room. So you need to get permission first before you ask. Other than that, I hope the review goes well and you have a great day.